Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with Ask Dave. And the question actually is a very, very interesting one. A reader writes, he didn't give me his name, he's just a dash Yeme, Y-E-M-E dash. But it's a very good question, and I'd like to address it. It is this. He writes, I wonder if you'd speak, let me see if I can read this, on why composers have chosen to keep writing for ensembles and orchestras of the same instruments and eschewed the synthesizer or other modern instruments. From the early modern period onward through the Baroque and classical eras, instruments were being invented and updated, and composers seized the new opportunities and wrote with the new sound palettes available to them. Then it mostly stopped. Composers continued to write for the established makeup of the orchestra and smaller ensembles, and the occasional dangerous lunatic might write for a string quartet plus, say, a bassoon, an oboe, or some such radical madness. But do we think that if we could present one of the undeniable geniuses of the past, a Mozart or whatever, with a synth and say, here, this machine can make any sound you can imagine, go nuts, they would come back with, I'm good, thanks, and keep churning out stuff for the violin? Now, of course, I know that some composers experiment more than others, so perhaps it might be better to ask why adoption of new instruments has not become mainstream in classical music. But it does seem to me that the majority remain wedded to instruments and ensembles that have barely changed for around 200 years. Is it fear of not being taken seriously? Fear of the censor of the classical music establishment? The fact that their education must have revolved around the same instruments and ensembles? Question mark? Well, Mr. Yeme, first of all, you're totally wrong. I am happy to say you have no clue what you're talking about. And that's the truth. I mean that in the jolliest possible sense. New instruments are always being written for in classical pieces, always, constantly. Let's first talk about instruments themselves. The saxophone family has been widely adopted in the classical music universe. And in the 20th century, there have been all kinds of new instruments that have been adopted without any difficulties. Electric guitars get used, and even synthesizers. But we have to make a distinction between works written for individual instruments that may be new and works written for ensembles of traditional instruments that may absorb new instruments. The symphony orchestra has changed unbelievably in the past 200 years. It just depends which section you're talking about. For example, brass bands. There is no comparison between a brass band of the 20th century and one of the 19th. I mean, they use all kinds of new instruments and in all kinds of fascinating ways. Aside from the regular improvement of existing instruments, the section of the orchestra that's undergone the most change, I am happy to say, is the percussion section. Percussion was virtually unheard of in the Baroque period. In the classical period, if you were doing something Turkish, you might get bass drums, cymbals, triangle, and some jingling or rattling sucker, and that was about it. From the 19th century on, more and more instruments began to impinge on the percussion section and become part of the standard symphony orchestra. Tons of them. And in the 20th century, all hell broke loose. Think of Edgar Varese and all of this stuff. I mean, a percussion section these days has to be able to routinely call upon dozens, I would even say hundreds, of different instruments that may be part of the overall classical ensemble. So the idea that everyone's been playing the same old instruments forever is ridiculous. A lot of those instruments have persisted in ensembles. Why? Because composers wrote for them. I mean, it's a self-fulfilling argument. If you want your work for orchestra to be played, you have to write for an orchestra. And the orchestra has to be constituted in such a way that your work is performable. Otherwise, people can't do it. They physically can't do it. I mean, that's why performance ensembles exist, because of the repertoire that was written for them. And you can't complain that it would have been better if they were writing for, schnozhorns instead of a string quartet. Go find a schnozhorn quartet. I mean, people have to make a living. They have to be trained. They have to learn how to play these things. But there are a number of wonderful modern instruments that people use all the time. And they've added back old instruments, for example, the harpsichord, which was as good as dead until like the 19-somethings, and which composers routinely use. So I completely disagree with the proposal, with the idea that composers don't write for unusual instruments and that ensembles don't include them. They do, they have, they always will, and they will continue to include new instruments as long as the music itself seems worthy of performance. And it's very interesting in that respect because we don't give enough credit, I think, to performing arts ensembles for performing works that are tremendously challenging and difficult and costly and expensive. Think of Messiaen's Turangalila Symphony. It's a repertory piece now. You've got to have an amazing solo piano, a solo keyboard glockenspiel. Not everybody has one of those. And a vibraphone solo as well. I mean, tremendous ability, a tremendous player on mallet instruments, which all percussionists can do now, and which they couldn't do at all in centuries past. I mean, the instruments didn't exist, and people didn't know how to play them. When Saint-Saëns used a xylophone in the Danse Macabre, it caused a riot, an absolute riot. When César Franck put an English horn in the Symphony in D minor, it caused a riot. Now nobody thinks twice about using those instruments. So yes, there is regular change. But the most important thing about something like the Turangalila Symphony is the Ondes Martenot, an electronic instrument that people can routinely use nowadays, even though you have to rent them. I mean, most people don't own them. You don't keep them in your closet or, in the garage. It's like, oh, I'm going to go get my Ondes. It doesn't work that way. You rent them from the Ondes Martenot rental, Hertz Ondes Martenot rentals or Avis or something like that. You rent it and you have to find someone who knows how to play the damn thing, but then you can do it. Now, let's talk about electronic music. That's a sort of a different category, and it's something that we also need to mention. Tons and tons and tons of modern composers use electronic instruments, but an electronic instrument, a synthesizer is not a musical instrument, really. It's a sound-making device. But like you said, and this the writer says, you can make any kind of sound you want. Well, if you can make any kind of sound you want, then you don't need an orchestra at all. And there are, of course, entire conservatory programs devoted simply to electronic music or to electroacoustic music, if you want to call it that. And composers regularly write for that stuff, but it doesn't get performed. And the reason it doesn't get performed that often outside of the electroacoustic ghetto is because there's no standardization at all. You have to be particularly trained on the certain piece of equipment to make the sounds that piece of equipment is making. That notwithstanding, there are many contemporary works that use electronics routinely. I mean, composers use electronics all over the place. I remember going to see the premiere of Rautavaara's opera Alexis Kivi in Finland. I mean, he writes for an ensemble, a fascinating ensemble. It's nothing but strings and a little bit of percussion and 2 clarinets and electronics, because he was able to get all the other sounds he wanted in a limited performance space by using electronics. And the electronic effects are perfectly and beautifully integrated into the instrumental textures. It all depends on the imagination of the composer. And if the composer writes something that's fabulous, that demands the use of electronics, and people want to play it, it will get played. So these things are all possibilities that individual composers can take advantage of. And to say that it doesn't happen is it just betrays an ignorance of what the repertoire is, of what contemporary composers are doing, and what the modern orchestra contains. I mean, there are works that use rock bands. I mean, Bernstein's Mass, things like that. People play this music. It gets played all the time. And it uses electronics, it uses crazy percussion, it uses new instruments. I saw a performance of Penderecki's The Seven Gates of Jerusalem when we gave him a Lifetime Achievement Award at Midem, which uses tubuphones or tubulophones or tububophones or boobity-phones or something like that. These giant plastic industrial plumbing pipes that you hit with ping pong paddles and things like that. And they go pop, 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 and they're sort of generally pitched. It was a fascinating sound. It's a regular thing. This is a question that is a red herring, a total red herring. The more you know about the repertoire, the more you realize that composers have always taken advantage of whatever they could get their little paws on, and those things became part of the orchestra or the opportunity of the ensemble to play. And finally, the last answer, frankly, to this question about why is the ensemble, why haven't they changed? Why haven't they, aside from the repertoire being written for them, the symphony orchestra, for example, it's because it's not just one thing. A symphony orchestra is infinitely flexible. It can contain virtually any configuration of instruments that a composer can dream up. And it has, and we see it all the time in the repertoire. No two pieces are written for the exact same number of players. I mean, when we're talking about from one period to the next. A Haydn symphony, a Dvorak symphony, a Shostakovich symphony, they all have different numbers, different forces, different balances, different constituents within each section. It's not just one thing. It's not the same old, same old. It's a constantly renewing series of timbral possibilities. And composers choose the timbral possibilities that benefit their inspiration, number one, and from a pragmatic sense, logistically speaking, give them the best opportunity to actually be played. And that, my friends, is the answer to that question. So keep on listening, friends. Keep asking those questions. Take care.